Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Build Computers. This is the Corsair Carbide 175R RGB. And I'm not going to be doing a full review on this. This is going to, I guess I'll call this a light review or something like that. So the main reason why I'm not doing a full review of this, I had planned on doing so. However, I've just taken it out of the box and discovered that it is literally a Corsair 220T just with a really crap front panel on it. So basically the entire body of this chassis, except for the front panel, is identical to the Corsair 220T. So if you want to know if you want to know all the details on the inside and what it's like to build in and stuff like that, just watch my coverage of the 220T. But I thought I'd make a video on this anyway, just to show you guys what you're getting, because it is a slightly interesting case because it's very cheap, which is why I bought one for a fairly cheap gaming build I'm doing. I'm doing a fairly modest game build where the budget for the tower was £700, bearing in mind that, no, slightly less than that. It was about sort of 650 to 700, bearing in mind that I'm in business to make money, so I actually want a margin in that as well. So, you know, closer toward the 600, 650 kind of mark as well, because, yeah, there's no point in me getting out of bed for less than 50 quid. However, this one cost, let me look it up, £60 Great British pounds or $70 US. And so 60 quid or $70 for a Corsair case, for a modern Corsair case, is pretty good. Normally, if you want something from Corsair down at that kind of price figure, you're looking at some of their older cases that are not bad cases. They've just been around for a long time and they look very dated by modern standards and they don't have tempered glass or anything like that. Whereas this is a modern Corsair case and you get tempered glass and all the rest of it, and it's 60 quid or $70. So for that does fit into a budget gaming build thing, just about, 60 or 70, 60 quid, $70 is really pushing it when you're trying to drive down the cost of a build. As I say, when you're on a budget, and obviously you want to blow all your budget on the graphics card and the CPU, that's where you want to put your money. However, also you don't want to put it in a really cheap, tacky case, because I don't want to sell a computer that looks really cheap and tacky. So you've got to balance having something that looks nice and is well presented in a case that doesn't flex and flop off of the bench, but also leave enough of your budget to put, a decent CPU and graphics card in there. So I managed to just about squeeze this in to the budget. So yeah, and also it said it was RGB and it came with a Corsair RGB fan, and I was like, ooh, yeah, okay, that sounds good. But here's the problem. So the inside, it's a Corsair 220T on the inside. It's fairly decent. You get full ATX in there. This is quite a small case for ATX. This is very compact for an ATX size case. However, that comes at a price that building in it can be quite awkward. There are good access holes along the top here and along the bottom. However, as soon as you put the motherboard in, all of those access holes get blocked. So you have to make sure you run all of your cables before you put the motherboard in. So this is very much a power supply in first case. Power supply and all of the case wires do all of that first, then drop your motherboard in. It's got a decent power supply enclosure, and you can mount your power supply either way up, which is nice because I like to have the fan pointing upwards instead of downwards. And it's also got room for 2 full-size drives down here as well. The size of the power supply is a bit limited. You want to stick to normal size power supplies that are like, 150, 160 mil long tops, that kind of thing. Otherwise, you will potentially have to remove that drive cage to make room for big power supplies. Likewise, this thing can be restrictive on the length of graphics card you can fit. And if you put a top mount water cooler in there, it will not clear tall RAM, or you may have difficulty with tall RAM. So there's lots of ifs, maybes, and sometimes surrounding this case. However, when you get the combination just right, you can have quite a nice, tidy ATX build in a fairly compact case. However, the 175R, if I just remove the front panel like that, this front panel is just a sheet of plastic. It's not metal, but again, at this price point, I wouldn't expect it to be. And this logo here lights up, and there's an RGB fan. But this is where the issue comes in. I assumed that RGB fan was going to be an SP120 Pro, which is Corsair's starter RGB fan. It certainly looks like one. However, it's a 3-pin fan, and it has just an ordinary 4-pin RGB header on it. This is not even addressable. It's just 12-volt analog RGB, which means this thing is not individually addressable. And literally what they've done is they've mounted this fan up front, in the front panel no less, which means it's going to get terrible airflow, because it means it's right up against here, and you've got this slot up here for the airflow coming in, and then it's baffled along here for strength, and these baffles block even more airflow. So you're going to get terrible airflow from that fan, so that fan hub can light up the Corsair logo. So I feel slightly robbed, quite frankly. But yeah. The first thing I would recommend doing if you buy this case is unmount this fan and put it behind these rails so it actually gets some airflow. If you put this behind the rails, it will get some airflow, and heck, you could put another 1 or 2 there as well. The front panel does also have a vented bottom, so you could stick a radiator up the front there and it will get airflow. It won't be as good as the Corsair 220T with its mesh front, however, it will get adequate airflow. But yeah, it's a bit of a bummer that they've stuck that up there. I'm not super thrilled about that. But I reckon even if you move this fan behind the rails, I still think your logo will light up. But the thing is that if I'm going to have one fan in a case, I'd rather put it at the back as an exhaust fan. Because in my experience, it's far more, if you're doing a build with very limited case fans in it, it's generally better to stick what fans you've got as exhaust fans, so they are getting hot air out of the case, and you go for negative air pressure. 9 times out of 10, that's more effective than just having a single lone fan up front, trying desperately to blow cold air into the computer straight into a positive pressure of hot air. So yeah, and therein lies the issue, is it means that straight away you're going to want to move this RGB fan to the back, and then your front logo isn't going to light up anymore. And I think that's a bit of a pity, because with very little extra effort, they could have just stuck an LED, like even if they put a white LED or something there, they could have just made that light up as like the power LED or something like that. So if you're buying this for any kind of serious build, you can spend like another £20, maybe £25 and get a Corsair 220T. And that is going to come with 3 SP120 Pro RGB fans that are proper Corsair addressable fans, and the lighting node core, which is a Corsair iCUE RGB controller. So from a bang for buck perspective, suddenly this case has very much fallen apart. However, for my use case here, where I'm building an entry-level gaming rig as cheap as I possibly can, it does grind that much more off the price. And taking another 20 quid off of the price tag is the difference between me being able to afford to stick that GTX 1660 in it, or having to drop down to a cheaper graphics card like an RX 570 or 580 or something like that. So, as I say, saving that extra 20 quid was valuable to me because I'm budgeting, and I have a budget that I have to conform to. But if you're building, obviously the budget is whatever you've got in your wallet, so it's kind of up to you as to what you want to do there. As I say, if you're building for yourself, my advice would be to spend the extra 20 quid and get the 220T. However, if you've got your heart set on this case because the price point is what you require, then the rest of the case will be of pretty decent build quality. My only major beef with this chassis design was that, as I say, as soon as you put the motherboard in, it's very difficult to cable tidy. So you've got to make sure you put the motherboard in last in the build, or rather late in the build. And then in addition to that, as soon as you want to put water cooling in this thing, it starts getting very, very cramped with big graphics cards as well. However, for simple builds, this thing will be absolutely fine. So certainly for what I'm doing now, where it's going to be air-cooled with a GTX 1660 in it, we're going to have loads of room in this thing. So it'll be fine. So that's about it for my first impressions. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to carry on building this thing up, and I'll just see what else we come across here. If I have any more interesting insights into this, then I will carry on talking and waffling. Failing that, we may just cut to a musical montage of me building it up. So here's the RGB fan that it comes with. I'm not sure what model this is, or even if it has a model per se, because it doesn't really fit into the Corsair iCUE meta, because this is not an iCUE fan. This guy just plugs into an analog RGB header, which means it's very compatible with motherboard RGB controllers and third-party RGB controllers. However, it's not addressable and will not talk to an iCUE system. And that is kind of a bummer, because it means if you're buying this because you're like, oh, this will be a launching point for my iCUE setup, this fan will not fit into your iCUE setup. Again, if you want to go iCUE, get the 220T, because that does come with an iCUE compatible equipment. So yeah, no frills fan. It does have the nice Corsair design though. You know, it's got the nice semi-transparent rotor on it with 6 LEDs in the hub. So the illumination on that will be quite pleasant, I think. So yeah, if you do want to use this to light up the logo on the front of the case, you might just want to take off that sticker on front, because then you'll get more light coming out the front of it. Just a thought. However, I'm going to relocate this to the back of the case because it'll be more visible there and it'll do more there as well. Unlike on the 220T though, because I've got no triple fans at the front, I've actually got room to slide the hard drive cage all the way up to the front of the case. So that does actually afford me much more space for the power supply. We've actually got a very decent amount of room there now. So if you don't care about having a triple intake at the front of your case, then this one is actually a good option. You could do the same thing with the 220T. You could drop out that bottom front fan, but I think it'll look a little bit strange. And that is essentially it. So the RGB fan, it's a bit wobbly on its axis. I'll just give you a close-up of that. Yeah, the camera's not quite fast enough to see it, but it's not a great fan. Like, I wouldn't, apart from having some not awful LEDs in it, I wouldn't really call this a Corsair fan. So yeah, they kind of picked a really cheap fan out of the bin and stuck some LEDs in it, and that was about it. So again, my disappointment with here is that, you know, when you buy a case with Corsair written on it, you expect Corsair, and this fan ain't Corsair, if you see what I mean. So yeah, but you know, it adds a little bit of a glow in there, I guess, but you can't build on this because, you know, if you went to any other RGB system, you'd want to swap that fan out anyway. If you went for a non-Corsair RGB setup, then you would buy those cheap addressable LED multi-packs that you can get. Because cheap addressable LED fans are really cheap on places like Amazon. You can get a pack of 3 for like $30 kind of thing with a controller. And then if you went full Corsair, you would be going iCUE, and this wouldn't work with any of your iCUE kit. So you kind of can't win with this thing, and it's just there, I guess. I don't know. At face value for 60 quid, it's not a bad case, but it doesn't make sense for anyone it doesn't make sense for anyone other than a system integrator, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't really consider myself a system integrator, but for me, where a customer has come to me and said, here is 800 quid, I want my son to have a gaming rig with a tower, mouse, keyboard, and a monitor. And obviously, £100 of that was spent on the monitor, keyboard, and mouse, which left me 700 quid to build a tower and make some money on the job. So yeah, and the other thing, of course, to keep in mind, this motherboard, that's not staying in there. That's not the actual motherboard I'm giving to the customer, because the motherboard I'm giving to the customer doesn't have RGB headers on it. So yeah, and if you're building on a budget, your motherboard might not have RGB headers on it. Quick pro tip, I did actually solve this one. So the motherboard that I used didn't have any actual RGB headers. However, it did have the AMD Wraith Prism RGB header. The little RGB header that goes near the CPU socket on most AMD motherboards. I plugged the RGB fan into that guy and it lit up just fine. So bear in mind that you may have little or no control over what that header is doing, depending on what software you run. However, it will just make the fan light up. So if you just want the fan to illuminate, which is all I needed it to do, then that'll work a treat. The case, all it had to do was just have a simple, dumb RGB cycle header inside it somewhere. So if you were building with no other RGB peripherals or headers available to you, you could plug it into that and just get color cycle or something. And all of the low-cost budget cases, all of the ones I've looked at, the XPG Invader, the GameMax Kamikaze Pro, those all had. And also, what was the one I looked at? Yeah, the Aerocool Aero 1 Eclipse. They were all around this price tag and had built-in addressable RGB. So this is the thing. You get the Corsair build quality, but you don't get any toys whatsoever. And the fan that you do get ain't a lot of use, really. So it's not a terrible case, but for anyone watching this, it probably makes a lot more sense to spend another 20 quid and get the Corsair 220T, which will just completely, literally outshine this thing and have exactly the same internal body. So yeah, it's not bad, but the Corsair 220T is better in every possible way, and it really doesn't cost much more. Yeah, make of that what you will. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.